considered, according to the Crown Counsel who takes your case, it could be an indictable offense. You could go to jail for up to 5 years. That's in the Cannabis Act. Why? No. So I decided I would do a deep dive on the Cannabis Act, and I have to stand up. My butt's killing me. The stage is killing me. I wanted to do a deep dive, and I figured, okay, the best way to do a deep dive is to write a book on the Cannabis Act. My dad, he wrote a book on the Bankruptcy Act, Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, so I followed his lead and wrote a book on the Cannabis Act. It's a terrible book. Nobody wants to read this book, trust me. But it was a way for me to learn about the law and to write about it in a not Bay Street way. Because everybody that was, all the lawyers in Toronto, not all of them, but most of the lawyers in Toronto, oh, that's awesome, thank you, sir. Most of the lawyers in Toronto were corporate lawyers that became cannabis lawyers, or criminal lawyers that became cannabis lawyers as well. And I may have been a plant in a former life, but I just didn't resonate with corporate or criminal law. So, I wrote the book, and the most important part of it, I just submitted my manuscript for the 4th edition. The 4th edition is so good because I spent so much time researching and reading all the stuff about how we got the first drug law in Canada to begin with, right? And I wanted to know why. I'm constantly asking why? Why do we have this stupid law? Why do we send people to jail for growing a plant? It doesn't make sense to me. And I wanted to find out the answer. I got the answer. It's in chapter 1. And I'm gonna give chapter 1 to anybody that wants. I'll just email it to you, okay? My publisher, LexisNexis, too bad. Everybody should have chapter 1, because chapter 1 goes through in detail, and it's a boring read, but it's worthwhile, because it talks about how we got the very first law. Anybody know what the first law against drugs was? You, sir?
For cannabis specifically?
All drugs, any drug law, first drug law.
Well, for legalization?
The first drug law in our country against a drug. 1923? Anybody else? 1936? Anyone else? Cheap seats over there? You? Anybody?
Late 50s?
Late 50s. Guys, okay, I'm giving every single one of you my chapter 1. Let's go back in time. Let's create a time traveling device right now. We're going to go back to the year 1907. Oh, 1907, okay? Now, it wasn't, no, that's not the year. 1908 is the year. I want to take you back to 1907 because I want to tell you what happened to create the first drug law in 1908. Just briefly. It's not a long story. It's not complicated. It's really awful, actually, and it's a disgraceful story. And we should all be ashamed, as Canadians, that this is part of our culture, and we need to own up to it, okay? We got the first drug law, and it's called the Opium Act. Why do you think it's called the Opium Act? Because it's against opium. Why? Ask yourself why. Why did we need a law in 1908 against opium? And what was that law? Nobody's ever actually seen the Opium Act here, right? This year, I got the reference library to give me a copy of the Opium Act. You wouldn't believe it. It's 2 sections. It's 1 page. It's 1 page. Section 1, opium's prohibited unless it's medical context. Unless it's medical use, it's prohibited. Number 2, give the manufacturers of opium 6 months to sell all their stuff so they won't be, charged. That's it. That's the first drug law. But why do we need a drug law against opium? And why are we criminalizing opium at all? Because Chinese Canadians smoked opium, mostly. Because Chinese Canadians sold it to white women. And Mackenzie King, who was the then Deputy Minister of Labor in his 30s, and very, very Christian and white, and wanted to keep the nation Christian and white, he wrote 5 reports in 1907 to 1908. 5 reports. This man was prolific, okay? And why did he write these reports? Because in 1907, there was a riot in Vancouver. And the riot was white trade unionist workers did not want Chinese Canadians to be in Canada anymore. They wanted it to be a white country. Now, they gathered together in a rally, and they called themselves the Anti-Asiatic Exclusion League, and they marched up Main Street, and when confronted by Japanese people, they started hurling rocks into windows, and there was a riot that broke out. This riot was well documented and reported on internationally. But Mackenzie King was the man, the point man, from the Department of Labor in Ottawa to come down to Vancouver and hand out reparations to those businesses that were affected. And in so doing, he chanced upon opium dens, because 2 opium manufacturers wanted reparations. And he was like, how is this possible? He wrote in his report that this thing called opium was an evil because of how he saw it affecting white Christian girls. And the newspapers of the time, I've done a deep dive on the newspapers of the time, and you wouldn't believe the stories that were written. So we're coming at a drug law in our country that we live under now, called the Cannabis Act. It's using the same framework. It's never changed over the last 100 years. It hasn't changed from 1908 until 2022. It's the same thinking. We need to criminalize substances. And the substances just got more and more, right? So yes, in 1923, you're correct, sir, cannabis was added. 1911, if I go back, cocaine and heroin were added, due to Mackenzie King as well. If you read his diaries, it's incredible. He talks proudly of it. And so more and more drugs got added to the law. And now, if you take a look online, you can go online and see the law. There's like 268 drugs, most of which you've never even heard of. They're all scientific names, but they're all criminalized. So if you make them, possess them, sell them, which some of them you don't even know what they are, you're going to go to jail. You're going to be fined. You're going to have a criminal record, right? This is the legacy from 1908 and 1907, from a riot gone wrong, from racism and adjusting the law from a provincial law, which was, there was a BC law against opium at the time, but Mackenzie King, he was like, no, this has to be a national issue. And so he brought it, and guess what? Was there a debate in the House of Commons? Were the white men in Parliament debating about whether or not we should criminalize opium? No, there was no debate at all. In fact, before, this is on record, you can read this in Hansard, before the person finished the introduction of like, we are now going to criminalize opium through the Opium Act, he was interrupted. And everybody started yelling, yes, I. It was a unanimous decision. Obviously, in that time, women didn't have votes. They weren't identified as people. People of color didn't have a vote. In fact, Chinese Canadians didn't even get a vote till 1947. So we're talking about an era of Canada that doesn't even make sense right now, right? But yet this is the context, the framework, the worldview that we're living under with our current law. So, given that, and given the research I was doing and the reading, it's all in chapter 1, I decided for the first time in my life to become politically active. Not make a document